Narcissistic relationships are places where your needs are secondary and even shameful. So to actually do what you need to be and feel healthy, to be responsive to yourself, well, that flies in the face of the premise of the narcissistic relationship. Let's talk about sleep. How'd you sleep last night? For many of you, I have a feeling the answer might have been okay. Now, you know this scenario well. Let's say it's one night you think about something the narcissist said or did. Their gaslighting, their manipulation, their blame shifting. It gets stuck in your head. Maybe it was a partner blaming you for their cheating. Maybe it was a toxic boss who stole an idea and didn't credit you for your contributions. Maybe it was a toxic mother or father or other family member who continually gets at you with their passive-aggressive barbs and their cruel words. Those things get stuck in your head. And we often see another pattern in narcissistic abuse raise its head, which we've already talked about, which is rumination. That rumination can often happen just as you're about to drift off to sleep. You think about that mistake that so many people make right before they go to sleep. What do? Yeah, they look at their phone. So then you see that one text message or email or social media post, invariably toxic or betraying, and they get stuck in your head. And sleep, after seeing that, is about as likely as a unicorn galloping into your bedroom. But the sleep difficulties don't end there. The more challenging pattern that often arises in narcissistic abuse, it's not the falling asleep, it's not the waking up in the morning, it's the waking up in the middle of the night when the rumination kicks in again. You may play that argument over and over again in your head. You may keep reading that nasty text, hear their comments, ruminate on the gaslighting, and wonder how you can fix it. And you simply cannot eliminate that thought from your head. So you wake up and you stare at the ceiling and it grinds through your head. That middle of the night waking with the rumination in your head may be the most common sleep challenge raised by narcissistic abuse. The other challenge raised by narcissistic abuse, of course, is that it leaves you exhausted. You are mentally depleted, always having to deal with the invalidation, the confusion, and just the unhappiness of being in such a hollow and abusive relationship. It's not a healthy life, and it does deplete you. So you are tired. But the intrusive thoughts and anxiety and confusion mean that now you have exhaustion coupled with interrupted sleep, which is a terribly unhealthy combination and makes it more likely that you're going to have more conflicts in your narcissistic relationship. When people ask me the one thing that you can do that can be a turnaround for your health, it's good sleep. One good uninterrupted night of sleep may be as close to a cure-all or a panacea we have in mental health. And we also know that sleep disturbance is a classical part of many mental illnesses and is a classical part of experiencing narcissistic abuse. So, by virtue of experiencing narcissistic abuse, you have limited access to something that can have myriad benefits for your health. Narcissistic abuse plus lack of sleep, it's a cruel catch-22. And the darker side is that consistent sleep disruption is actually really bad for your health. It can either exacerbate existing health problems you have and perhaps even render you vulnerable to new ones. If you originated from a narcissistic family of origin, so sadly, the sleep difficulties may have been a part of your childhood. Children from narcissistic families are terribly anxious, and that anxiety in children always disrupts their sleep. The invalidation of parents means that childhood fears around sleep and nightmares are minimized and trivialized. The chaos of narcissistic families mean that there can be noise, arguing, and chaos at bedtime. There's no one to really tuck them in and read them a story. The confusion of a narcissistic family means that a child may ruminate upon going to bed wondering, how can I be better? How can I be better? How can I get mommy to notice me? And poor sleep habits in childhood can generalize into poor sleep habits in adulthood. The chaos of narcissistic relationships means that chaos can quite often happen at bedtime. Tension, arguments, rage, and the closer to bedtime that these things happen, the greater the probability that you're going to have sleep difficulties that night. Another pattern that has sometimes been shared with me is from the people who feel compelled to get up very early, even after not getting enough sleep the night before, just to get some peace, to get their time away from the narcissist. The narcissist may still be sleeping, but there may be a real pull to take advantage of the few peaceful moments before the narcissist's negativity punctures your space. And this pattern may also apply on the front end of the night, which with some people saying they will stay up later than the narcissist so they can get their quiet time before bedtime. But when you couple the late bedtime or the early awakening with interrupted sleep, yep, it means you're getting inadequate sleep. So what do? Obviously, you follow the standard advice on sleep hygiene, but that advice can come up a little bit short here. The usual advice is a regular bedtime, a dark room, a cooler temperature, a comfortable bed, not looking at electronics or other blue light devices like TVs ahead of sleep, making sure those blue lights don't pop during the night, avoiding caffeine late in the day, avoiding alcohol, using white noise or other devices to cancel ambient noises needed. That's just sort of sleep hygiene. I'm going to tell you this right now. All the damned white noise in the world isn't going to stop the noises in your head when you're dealing with a narcissistic relationship. So while these are all good tips in general, the bottom line is the frustration of the narcissistic relationship is the issue, not staying up and playing Candy Crush at bedtime. And by the way, guilty. Number 2, be careful about pharmaceuticals as a regular way of getting to sleep. While sleep medications as prescribed by a physician can work in a pinch, regular reliance on them is not good for you. Work with your healthcare provider so you do not become reliant on prescription sleep medicine, maybe in a pinch, but not regularly. Number 3, if you haven't already, go take a look at the rumination video. Use some of the anti-rumination tips as a tool to squelch some of this thinking so it doesn't pour into bedtime and into the middle of the night. Number 4, I'm going to say it again, every single one of these videos, therapy. Talk about what's bothering you. Sometimes just venting, even if you are still in the relationship, can validate you and help you let go of some of it so you can sleep. Number 5, I want you to breathe. Breathing works. Deep breaths, mantras, and there are even apps out there that are supposed to offer some help with breathing and other sleep sounds and routines and just things that lull you into sleep. Maybe check into some of those too. It could just at least be a momentary distraction that helps you sleep. A lot of the usual sleep advice doesn't always work when you are experiencing a narcissistic relationship. In fact, there is interesting workplace research that indicates that a toxic work setting often does its greatest damage to us and our health through our sleep, which means you aren't functioning as well. Obviously, not having to deal with the narcissist would fix your sleep mighty fast, but if that's not an option, you need something else. Sometimes the tried and true techniques to manage a narcissist, realistic expectations, radical acceptance, and not engaging, can at least give you a toolkit to help you push back on the helplessness and rumination of the narcissistic relationship. So, of course, this is when I'm going to say good luck and hopefully good night. And before I let you go, think about that old saying. They say you're never supposed to go to sleep angry. Listen, if you're in a narcissistic relationship, you go to bed angry more often than not. So this is why I'm saying a lot of the prevailing wisdom on sleep can be tough when you're going through a narcissistic relationship. But at a minimum, and this is a quick fix, just don't read those text messages and emails an hour before bedtime. Invariably, A narcissist will often not respect the boundaries of time and send you a nasty work email, a nasty text, whatever it is, late at night so you can ruminate over it. Do not look at it. Get an old-fashioned clock if you want to be able to tell the time at night, but do not look at your messagey watch or your phone in the middle of the night to figure out the time. Just that one place is a great place to start. So let's talk a little bit about the physical symptoms we can see in people who are experiencing narcissistic abuse. So let's start with a question. Can narcissistic abuse literally make you physically ill? I'd base it on what I've seen. I'd say, yeah, it does. So let's just take this on solely from a stress perspective. Being in a narcissistic relationship is stressful, and stress has numerous impacts on health: headaches, muscle tension, diminished immune function, which can in turn make you more vulnerable to all kinds of illnesses. If you have pre-existing health conditions such as autoimmune disorders, asthma, diabetes, stress can exacerbate the course of your illness. And if you have a more acute illness, such as cancer, experiencing narcissistic abuse, as with any acute illness, may potentially result in a poorer course just because of the ongoing stress, which makes engaging in treatment, adherence, and coping all the more difficult. There are a couple of different pathways by which narcissistic abuse can actually affect your physical health. First, there's a sort of direct pathway as a source of stress, narcissistic abuse being a source of stress, and the release of stress hormones such as glucocorticoids, and then the glucocorticoid regulation. And these things impact immune functioning, as well as things like, for example, inflammatory responses that would exacerbate asthma, autoimmune diseases, and type 2 diabetes. And this glucocorticoid dysregulation is also associated with the onset of mental illnesses. Now, narcissistic abuse is a unique form of stress. It can be long-term. In some cases, it is inescapable. Many people still do not fully understand it. So there's a risk your experience with this stressor can be minimized by other people. And as you actually start feeling physically ill, you may not actually connect the toxic person in your life with the slow deterioration of your health. Doing the kind of research we need to do to substantiate this is not going to be easy. In an ideal world, we would follow people for many years, monitor their health, measure their relationships and the relationship quality and stress levels, and watch what happens. I hope someone does that relationship by the time, I hope someone does that research. By the time it comes out, I'm going to be long dead, okay? My observational perch on this, though, has been solely observational. I have watched otherwise healthy people develop illnesses that didn't make sense, given their age and their physical condition, or have had illnesses that had much more complex courses. And the one thing that they had in common was long-term relationships with people who had very difficult personalities. The physical effects we observe in people experiencing narcissistic abuse can also happen through indirect pathways. Specifically, people experiencing narcissistic abuse stop taking good care of themselves. They don't adhere to their medication. They don't get good sleep. They don't get good nutrition. They don't engage in any healthy exercise. Those of you experiencing narcissistic abuse, and this was actually another episode in the series, you have terrible self-care. And since the narcissists in your life don't care whether or not you take care of yourself or not, but let me tell you this, those narcissists sure as hell ensure that they take very good care of themselves, and they expect everyone to get on board with that. You don't have someone reminding you to take care of you, stepping in, or actually caring for you. Over the long term, the person experiencing narcissistic abuse simply stops trying, can get bogged down in the apathy, and the futility of these relationships can translate into you not adequately taking care of yourself and taking the stance of, ugh, why bother? This is real, and I am a firm believer that these narcissistic relationships take years off of our lives. The constant sympathetic nervous system activation that a person experiences when they're in a narcissistic relationship, and by sympathetic nervous system, I mean that fight, flight, or freeze response, means that our bodies are running at a state of physiological strain that puts a lot of wear and tear on us for the long term. It's like driving a car into the ground and never getting the oil changed or the car maintained. And for many people, narcissistic relationships are a lifelong struggle. It may be a parent that they've been grappling with all their lives, well into adulthood, or having had to deal with it in childhood. And now, in adulthood, you're dealing with a difficult or narcissistic partner or spouse. It can feel unrelenting. And I can promise you this, it is taking a toll on your body. Many people in narcissistic relationships report experiencing a sort of brain fog. It's sort of this sense of not being able to think straight or think well or think sharply. It's interesting because it's very similar to what people who have other forms of brain fog. Where I've most commonly heard this is those who are completing or have completed, for example, a course of chemotherapy, people taking other kinds of medications, people living with fatigue-inducing disorders. And those are other places that brain fog happens. Brain fog is also a commonplace issue in people living with narcissistic abuse, and it can exacerbate an already growing sense of self-doubt and confusion. If you grew up with a narcissistic parent or parents, you may have struggled with the physical symptoms of narcissistic abuse through stomach aches, headaches, even skin rashes, which are all ways that stress can physiologically manifest in a child. As a child, you may have also been more prone to colds and other viral illnesses. Listen, a child can't even put a name to this, but the child obviously is going to get exhausted from walking on eggshells and living with an unappeasable parent. Researchers such as Janice Kiecolt-Glaser have documented the deleterious health effects of marital conflict on immune function. Her research is actually quite fascinating. I always think that we could potentially extrapolate her research to narcissistic relationships. Narcissists certainly do not fight fair, and years of the toxic, difficult conflict and abuse is likely to be wearing down your immune system. So the short answer really is that your narcissistic relationship may be hazardous for your health. So what do? First of all, if you haven't done this for a long time, please get a physical, and ideally get regular physicals, especially if you're in a narcissistically abusive situation. At a minimum, you'll be able to monitor the onset of any preventable or early detectable health conditions, and at a minimum, stay on top of your health. Number 2, please at least do the preventative healthcare stuff that you can. Try and eat better. Sleep a little bit more, sleep under better conditions if you can. Take your medications regularly. Get some activity into your life. Do not wait for the narcissist to step up and offer to have your back when it comes to your health. In general, they don't really care. Narcissistic people don't like sick people. And you will exhaust yourself if you try to induce them into caring about you and your health. Number 3, please be aware of your own family health history so you know your own health vulnerabilities. Again, this ties into that first recommendation I made to get regular screenings for your health. But this becomes doubly important if there are family health issues that can place you at greater risk for the dangerous effects of stress-induced illnesses. Number 4, look alive with infectious diseases, especially during flu season. And I'm saying this during a pandemic, okay? This also matters for that too. If you're enduring narcissistic abuse, odds are your immune system isn't the best. And since the narcissist is not going to take care of you if you get sick, it's better you don't get sick in the first place. Number 5, please have a real plan in place if you get sick. If you think your narcissist is going to be the one who's always ready to drive you to chemotherapy or doctor's appointments, think again. Because even if they do step up to the plate, they're going to complain about it a lot. Make a plan with friends or other family members. Don't make the mistake that so many others who have experienced narcissistic abuse have made. Don't think that once you get sick, that the narcissist will finally step up and take care of you. It's not going to happen. And you do not want to be scrambling after all of this, after you get sick, while enduring the grief that in fact, the narcissist does not have your back, even when you're sick, because the fantasy is that's when they'd step up. Number 6, therapy. Therapy is important. It's an important stress-busting tool and a great place to learn tools to cope, not only hopefully with this relationship, but also with stress, and just have a place to let it all out. So when I say that narcissistic abuse makes you sick, I really mean it. If you can't get out of this relationship, and I know a lot of you can't get out of your narcissistic relationships, set the boundaries you need to stay healthy. Even if your narcissist doesn't care, there are people in your life who do. For once, please choose yourself. Your health may depend on it. And I want to leave you with one last tip, because I asked you about, I told you you need to know your family history. What gets really tricky is if part of your family is narcissistic, they may not be as forthcoming with their family history. While everybody's still young enough and alive, please get that information, because you may need to ask a benevolent aunt who lives on the other side of the country or the world. Quickly get all that health information, because if you do have limited communication with a narcissistic family member, you may not be able to get that comprehensive health history, and you would be surprised how useful some of these sorts of health historical issues can be for your healthcare provider, especially given the stress you're under because of narcissistic abuse, to understand your health and the vulnerabilities you may have to stress. So, have any of you ever had self-care be shamed? We live in a world where everyone's like, self-care, self-care. Well, have in your narcissistic relationship, were you taught that was a bad thing? Share your thoughts on that in the comments, because I know somewhere along the line of being in a narcissistic relationship, I was taught that self-care was a bad thing. I personally am not a big fan of the term self-care. It sounds a little bit too much, go to the spa, light candles, take a bath, brief respite, before you have to throw yourself back into some toxic spaces in your life. But when you really use the term right, it's not just spa stuff. Self-care is about being responsive to yourself, giving yourself a break when you're having a tough day, nourishing yourself, and simply just being aware of what you need and giving that to yourself. It may be like taking a break, putting stuff down and saying, you know what, I'm going to take a nap. The loss of self-care is a standard experience for anyone in a narcissistic relationship. And it's unfortunate, because if there was ever a group of people that require self-care, it is people in these kinds of toxic relationships. In a way, self-care would be the only way to survive. So one would wonder, what happens? How do narcissistic relationships erode self-care? First, Narcissistic people will shame your self-care, though they take pretty damn good care of themselves. The vast majority of people I have worked with throughout my career, and it doesn't matter what kind of relationship it was, parent, partner, work, other family, have said without exception that if they were caught engaging in self-care, that they were called selfish, self-indulgent, or it was those things were quietly implied with passive-aggressive remarks like, oh, wow, you must not be working that hard. Do you really have time for that? Or, did you actually get done all the stuff you said you were going to get done? Or, oh, is that really how you're going to spend your money? Or even, wow, is it really any wonder you don't get anything done if you're just sitting around? Whatever dig they get in, narcissistic relationships in general are a place where your needs go to die. Your needs, not theirs. This is really unfortunate if this originates in childhood, because engaging in anything that resembles self-care can feel impossible when you reach adulthood. You may see a parent doing it, but yet everyone else would be shamed for engaging in it. Narcissistic relationships are places where your needs are secondary and even shameful. So to actually do what you need to be and feel healthy, to be responsive to yourself, well, that flies in the face of the premise of the narcissistic relationship. Now, if you find hidden ways of caring for yourself, that could work. But that's not how it's supposed to work. Self-care shouldn't be a shame, like a sort of the idea of you sort of taking care of your needs on the sly, as though your needs are somehow shameful, feels like the equivalent of sneaking behind the building and sneaking a cigarette. But the implicit message is the sort of Cinderella of it all. You can go to the ball if you take care of every single thing around here and make our dresses and make sure we look good, and then maybe you can go, but we're going to sabotage you at the end anyhow. That's what self-care pursuits look like in a narcissistic relationship. Only if all of their needs are met, you do everything they say, the house is perfect, the work is perfectly done, everything is just right. Then and only then could you even ponder doing something you need for you. Otherwise, you are being selfish. And even then, they may sabotage what you set up for yourself or the time you need to do what you need. Here's the thing, self-care on a schedule doesn't always work. You don't always know when you're going to need a minute to gather yourself. Sure, it certainly is nice, and it's actually a good thing to schedule something pleasurable. But odds are that that massage isn't always going to fall on the day you need it. And on that day, when you feel invalidated, or you had a negative interaction, or just a bad day, or were really gaslighted, sometimes you need a minute. And that needing a minute is what often gets pathologized in a narcissistic relationship. Doubly awful is that the narcissistic people will always take the time they need for themselves, and then some. I think this idea of self-care as a luxury needs to be halted, and instead, self-care doesn't need to take hours, but it simply may be the few minutes you give yourself after a particularly bad day, or after reading a really uncomfortable email. The night you opt to not cook or let the laundry go so you can get some rest. It's recognizing that you don't need to be superhuman. And sometimes you just have human needs. Narcissistic relationships push us to be perfectionistic robots. The idea that maybe there is a point of enough where we will get it right and they'll be okay with us and then we can breathe. That moment doesn't exist, and there's no such thing as perfect, and we are not robots. We are people who, in many cases, after years of toxic relationships, need a minute more than anyone else to realign, to fall out of negative mindsets, to be kind to ourselves. The shaming of self-care over the course of a narcissistic relationship can mean that a person can get very burned out and put themselves at risk for depression or physical health issues. So many people want the humanity of the narcissistic person to come out, for them to wake up one day and want us to engage in self-care or support our self-care. It typically doesn't happen. But even more terribly, a legacy is that people in these relationships never really learn how to do it for themselves. This isn't about resorts, like I said, and candlelit bathtubs. This is about survival, about being responsive to your own fatigue, your own emotions and experiences. There is no enough with them. And if you remain in one of these relationships, you just have to recognize that what you do for yourself will be critiqued and shamed. And if you decide to leave one of these relationships, recognize that learning self-care in a meaningful, responsive way will actually not be that easy. In early days, you may feel guilty when you engage in self-care. The internalized voice of the narcissistic person in your life still ringing through, especially if they're still in your life. But over time, just as you wouldn't walk on a broken leg or drive on a flat tire, you would fix those things first. It's the same with us. Sometimes we as people, human beings, need a minute. The guilt, yeah, it's going to be uncomfortable. But tolerate it as you try to get to the other side and give yourself what you need, even if it is just a minute. Self-care is really, really complicated, and it's a very two-sided, sort of two sides out of the same mouth. Narcissistic people make sure they've got their golf game scheduled, and they're this scheduled, and they're that scheduled. But because other human beings are often viewed as functionaries in their lives, you would be quite surprised if your coffee maker walked off the counter and decided to go off to get a massage and get its hair done. It's a coffee maker. Its job is to make your coffee. It's a thing. Well, when you recognize that that's how the narcissistic person views you, and would almost recognize with the same absurdity, well, what are you doing just walking off and taking care of yourself? Either you will be looked at in a perplexed manner, or even when you take those little moments for yourself, feet up, taking a moment, and having that shamed, it can be really, really difficult to give yourself the time and space to actually do this for yourself without feeling guilty. But it's a really, really important thing to learn as part of your healing. So let's talk about fatigue. It's exhausting. It's exhausting to talk and not be heard, to share something about your life or a feeling and be gaslighted, to live your life and be invalidated, to tell the truth and then be faced with a lie, to try to win a person over just to feel like you're not enough, and recognizing that nothing you do will change this. It's exhausting. You know, it's one thing to work hard to climb up a mountain and get to the summit. You're exhilarated. The hard work paid off. You get to see the big view. Now imagine walking and walking and walking up a hill, but you never get to the top. That's exhausting. Fatigue is a physically really debilitating aspect of narcissistic abuse. As you can imagine, it's a byproduct of other patterns observed in narcissistic abuse, of the sleep difficulties, of that thing I called anergia. And it's more than just physical fatigue. It's a psychological fatigue. There's no other way to put it. These relationships are exhausting. They feel pointless. They are the summitless mountain, the journey that has no point. Futility and fatigue are closely related. Fatigue saps you of a sense of hope and future. And many of the symptoms discussed in the A-Town video are a byproduct or predicted by fatigue: the apathy, the anhedonia, and the anergia. It's awful to feel fatigued. Listen, you may even be getting enough sleep, but still be fatigued, secondary to narcissistic abuse, because of the confusing abyss that lies in front of you day after day. I'm a big believer that knowledge can help a little with this. If you know what you are dealing with, you may not be as wiped out by the sense of surprise or disappointment which so often accompanies narcissistic abuse. Many people blame themselves, and in fact, the narcissist may become quite frustrated with you for being fatigued. They might tell you that you're boring, or even worse than that, for being tired and not at all showing any concern for your fatigue. And okay, that doesn't really make sense, but okay. But once you are clear on what this fatigue is, some of that good old radical acceptance helps. Because then you might feel a slightly greater sense of mastery if you radically accept. Because honestly, the sadness and grief that this is your life, that these are your circumstances, can leave you with that heavy fatigue that accompanies the recognition that, yes, this is my life, but also the recognition of the idea that without making a major change, whether you leave the relationship or go no contact, that you may or may not be willing to make, then there isn't much that you can do about what you're in, so you feel fatigued. Fatigue can make you feel older and wearier than your years. Interestingly, I am currently actually experiencing a little bit of a bout of narcissistic abuse in my life. Yeah, me. None of us are immune, gang. So like I'm going through these waters now. And what's striking me is I'm so struck by the fatigue and what a central pattern it is to narcissistic abuse. But it's an existential tiredness. It's a heaviness. It would take 1,000-year nap to move this. This isn't just about getting a good night's sleep. And sadly, when somebody sees you're fatigued, you know what they tell you? You just need to take a nap. That's the guidance you get from people who don't understand narcissistic abuse. So, what do? First of all, be kind to yourself. Turn inward if you need. Cut out a lot of the BS that you don't need to have to deal with on that day. Turn the tap off on the toxic people and maybe the toxic responsibilities in your life. Give yourself the space you need and just practice a little bit of self-kindness. You might have a little bit more bandwidth the next day. Number 2, always rule out other causes for fatigue. While it's very likely that the narcissistic abuse is a major driver of your fatigue, in case that this might be due to a medical condition, you want to get that ruled out. Thirdly, you must expect no sympathy from your narcissist. Don't tell them that you're tired just to be gaslighted by them. My favorite is when you tell someone, oh, I'm tired, and your narcissist says, you aren't tired, you have no right to be tired. Don't tell them you're fatigued. And even if you do tell other people, be prepared for simplistic guidance like take a nap. Trust me, there ain't no nap long enough to take to push back on this ancient fatigue of narcissistic abuse. Number 4, lots of us are feeling fatigued now. The world has gone upside down and our lives don't make sense in the same way. For those who are enduring narcissistic abuse at the same time as all the things that are going on in the world, fatigue is almost a guarantee. Try not to hold unrealistic standards and keep a more realistic pace. And you know what? Please stop watching the Instagram posts of people making four-course quarantine dinners and baking home-baked bread. Listen, make yourself a sandwich and call it a day when you need. Fatigue sucks. It shows on your face and in your work and all that you do. It doesn't feel good. It can leave you feeling like you're always kind of sick and not keeping up. I have been struck, though, by how often fatigue improves almost right away when people step away from the narcissist in their lives. And when that isn't possible, it often isn't, please try other things like boundaries, disengagement, and realistic expectations. It may not fully disarm the narcissist in your life, but at least it may give you a greater sense of control. And then maybe you can try to get a good night's sleep, but like I said, it's going to take a lot more than one good night of sleep to push back on this fatigue. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of unhealthy or maladaptive coping. When people are stressed, especially that kind of can't get away from it daily stress over time, that stress that doesn't abate, over time, many people's coping with that isn't always healthy. When a person turns to coping behaviors that are not good for them, a psychological term we may use for this, or can use for this, is maladaptive coping. Maladaptive or unhealthy coping refers to a whole range of behaviors. Examples could include drinking excessively or drinking to cope, or using drugs to cope, eating poorly, eating excessively, spending and shopping on things you don't need and putting your own finances in peril, gambling excessively, avoiding physical activity, spending excessive time on activities that may actually reinforce your rumination or just aren't productive for you. For example, hours and hours spent on social media. This can also veer into other behaviors that may be a manifestation of other patterns of narcissistic abuse we've already talked about. Things like becoming isolated and avoiding other people, not engaging in good self-care. And this could even be things like not even showering as often as would be good for you, or just constantly leaving your house a mess and disheveled. Again, any of these unhealthy things you did, drop these in the comments. Now, none of this is good for you. Neither is being in a relationship with a narcissist, of course. The helplessness, the frustration, the confusion, the many other symptoms. A person may try to manage all of this through, not surprisingly, unhealthy coping. And sadly, at some level, this makes sense. Nothing else you're doing in this relationship is working, okay? So communicating with the narcissistic person or persons in your life doesn't work. No other behavior you try to engage in to please them or appease them works consistently. So at some point, many people will turn to a quick fix that will distract them, numb them, or might just leave them feeling temporarily good in the midst of a lot of discomfort. Now, nearly every person who has experienced narcissistic abuse will engage in some unhealthy or maladaptive coping. The helplessness engendered by narcissistic abuse alone is a catalyst. But when you think about it, when you engage in unhealthy coping, you're sort of harming yourself 2 times over. First, you're suffering in the narcissistic relationship, which isn't good for you. And then you're engaging in a behavior that is more often than not good for your health. So that's sort of 2 for the price of 1. Now, some people will say that they turn to the maladaptive coping as a way to not think about the relationship. And the days all sort of start to run into each other. Then one day, they look up and they recognize, wow, I've gained an unhealthy amount of weight. Or they might find that it's getting more and more difficult to get through the day without a drink. Or they take a look at their finances and realize they're in trouble, but they've wasted a bunch of their money on a bunch of junk. Money that also could have been used to help them get out of that narcissistic relationship. Perhaps go to school, put a deposit on an apartment. If you grew up with a narcissistic parent or parents, as a child, you may not have had as much access to sort of unhealthy ways of coping. In general, 6-year-old kids don't pour themselves martinis. But a child may find that they may seek refuge, maybe online, and spend too much time on devices, or just not feel able to do the activities they want. Maybe a child wants to do a sport, or take a class, a music class, or just have a day at the park, because their parent won't support it or do it with them. And so you can see In modern days, that child could easily get sluiced into the abyss of a phone or a tablet or other device for hours on end just to distract them from what they're experiencing. Or they may actually get schooled in maladaptive or unhealthy coping by either their narcissistic parent or, if they have one, the other healthier parent. The non-narcissistic sort of healthier parent may take their child on their shopping missions, or the child may mirror the parent's unhealthy and compulsive eating habits, the poor parent who might be trying to cope with this marriage. The child may then learn that eating sweets or eating excessively or eating junk food is a way to cope with a difficult situation, and may take that behavior into adulthood. Maladaptive coping or unhealthy coping is one of those patterns that is frequently observed in people who are experiencing and enduring narcissistic abuse. Even if you are doing something unhealthy, it may feel empowering to at least be doing something, especially something that in the short term may even be a little bit soothing. So what do you do to manage these unhealthy coping behaviors? Number one, people experiencing narcissistic abuse aren't the only ones who cope poorly, and so obviously the usual guidance we give to everyone on improving their coping and engaging in healthier coping applies. But with an asterisk. What do I mean by that? A lot of the conventional coping guidance teaches people to think differently about their situation or to problem solve. Well, unfortunately, if you are in a narcissistic relationship, you have a sort of unsolvable problem. But you can try to think differently about it. For example, engage in radical acceptance. Yeah, this person is not going to change. Or realistic expectations. Yeah, this is how it is, and might as well get used to it. So instead of getting disappointed and then triggered to engage in the maladaptive coping, you can start learning new and healthier substitutes. Take a walk, read a book, watch an episode of something you enjoy, call a friend, and it may not always work. But even if half the time you can shift gears and do something different that's healthier, it can make a big difference. Second, if the unhealthy or maladaptive coping is getting out of hand and you are becoming more reliant, for example, on alcohol and drugs, keep in mind that if this is escalating, it may require more significant intervention, whether that is some form of rehabilitation or seeking your primary care doctor and getting their guidance or consulting with a therapist. Many times, if that kind of drug or alcohol use is escalating, you may need further assistance with that. Third, do not share this issue with the narcissist in your life. Do not say to them, "Look what you've done to me." First of all, you don't want to give them the satisfaction. And secondly, they may sabotage you further. You and your unhealthy coping behavior may keep you in a subjugated position relative to your narcissist and can keep you stuck. Don't give them the satisfaction. Don't talk to them about it. Stress is a part of all of our lives, but the stress of narcissistic abuse is unique because of its inescapable quality and the fact that so few people understand it. So you may feel very alone and turn to quick and dirty tools for coping that may feel good in the moment, but can harm you in the long run. You may be wondering, does anybody out there cope in a healthy way? All of us get it wrong sometimes. All of us get us wrong. I got to tell you, I packed on the pounds during this pandemic because I have been stressed and I have been eating more. I mean, we all know it. But like I said, even if a third of the time, a half of the time, you can think about it differently and say, you know what, I could go for those cookies again. Or let me just, even if all I do is take a walk around the block, or even if I just watch this cheesy television show, something. Just a little bit of a mental break, sometimes just a reboot. Doesn't mean the narcissist is going to change and you're going to lift your eyes and your head and there they are still, standing there right in front of you. But just that moment of distraction can give you the reboot you need, and also, more importantly, maybe at least one time you're not engaging in these unhealthy patterns. A last question may be, well, what will happen? Are you telling me if I get out of this narcissistic relationship or this isn't in my life anymore, that I might be more likely to cope in a healthy way? Yeah. I've seen it happen over and over and over again with people who say, I got out of this toxic relationship and it was a turnaround for me. I changed how I ate. I wasn't walking on eggshells anymore. I use my spare time better. I respect myself again. When you're being chronically disrespected in a narcissistic relationship, it can be really hard to learn to respect yourself. Every journey begins with a single step. Again, would love to hear about your maladaptive coping. And if any of you turned that around, would love to hear about that too. Thanks again. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please, as always, subscribe or give us that like if you do, and look forward to seeing you next time.